Welcome to the deep dive. We're going deep into some really weird, bizarre scientific experiments today.
The kind that make you wonder what those scientists were thinking.
Yeah, exactly. Like, how did they even come up with these ideas
Yeah.
and then actually do them? We're using this book, Elephants on Acid and Other Bizarre Experiments by Alex Boas.
Oh, yeah, it's a classic. Lots of strange stuff in there. You ready to dive in?
Let's do it. So we're starting with the big one, the quest to beat death.
Like literally bring people back from the dead.
Yeah, scientists have been trying to do that for ages, going way back.
Like way back to the early 1800s with those experiments using galvanism.
Galvanism. Remind me what that is again.
Basically using electricity to stimulate muscles, make them twitch. So this guy, Giovanni Aldini, he would do these public demonstrations with corpses.
Oh, I remember reading about this. They would move their arms or open their eyes.
Yeah, it was pretty freaky. The book describes one with the body of this executed murderer, George Forster. Aldini hooked him up to these electrodes.
What happened?
Well, his jaw started quivering and then his eye popped open. People in the audience were freaking out.
I bet. It's crazy to think they thought he might actually be bringing Forster back to life.
It really shows how people thought about death back then. Like maybe it wasn't a hard line,
Right. Totally different from today. Now we have defibrillators, but that's not the same thing.
No, it's much more precise now. And we have, ethical rules about all this stuff.
Definitely. Okay, so Aldini was in Italy, but over in Scotland there was this other guy, Andrew Orr. He did similar experiments.
Oh yeah, Orr. He was a bit of a showman. He claimed he could use galvanism to make a corpse express emotions like anger or fear.
Wait, really? Like make a dead body smile or frown?
That's what he claimed. It was all very theatrical.
Sounds kind of creepy.
Oh, it was. And pretty controversial. Even back then, people questioned whether he was really doing what he said he was doing.
It's amazing to think that these early experiments, even though they might seem bizarre now, they actually paved the way for some important medical advancements.
Exactly. Without those early explorations of how electricity affects the body, we might not have things like pacemakers or defibrillators today.
True. It's like even those crazy ideas can sometimes lead to something good.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about trying to bring back the dead. Now let's fast forward a bit to a different kind of life-after-death experiment.
You're talking about Sergei Brukhanenko and the dog head, right?
Yep. That one always blows my mind. Keeping a dog's head alive detached from its body.
It sounds like science fiction, but Brukhanenko actually did it in the 1920s.
What was he even trying to do? What was the point?
He was a pioneer in organ transplantation. He wanted to see if he could keep organs alive outside the body. The dog head was his big demonstration.
And it actually worked, the head was conscious.
Yeah, the book describes how it reacted to light and sound. It even licked citric acid off its lips.
That's wild, but also kind of disturbing.
Oh yeah, super ethically questionable by today's standards. But it did advance our understanding of organ preservation.
It's like one of those things where the scientific achievement is incredible,
Yeah.
but you can't ignore the ethical issues.
Exactly. Okay, so we've gone from electric corpses to a living dog head. Ready for the next level?
Bring it on. What's next?
Head transplants.
Wait, full-on head transplants?
Yep. This is where Robert White comes in. He was a neurosurgeon obsessed with the brain. And he believed that head transplants were the ultimate way to study it.
Okay, now this is starting to sound like a Frankenstein movie.
It kind of was. He started with smaller steps, like removing a monkey's brain and keeping it alive on a stand with blood circulating through it.
Whoa. Like a disembodied brain. What was the point of that?
He thought he could study the brain's functions better if it was isolated from the body.
Right, but then he took it even further, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. He did a full head transplant on a monkey in 1970, attached its head to a new body.
And it lived.
It regained consciousness, but it couldn't move its body, and it was clearly suffering.
I don't even know what to say. It's incredible, but also horrific.
It's one of those things that makes you question how far science should go.
Totally. It's like, at what point does scientific curiosity cross the line?
White actually believed human head transplants could be possible one day. He thought it could help people with severe disabilities.
It's such a complex issue. On one hand, you want to help people, but on the other hand...
You have to think about the potential for harm, both to the individual and to society as a whole.
Right, and that's something that comes up again and again with these bizarre experiments. The line between ambition and ethics can get pretty blurry.
No doubt about it. And we're just getting started.
Okay, well, I'm both fascinated and a little terrified to see where this goes.
I hear you. But that's the thing about these experiments. They make you think and they make you question everything.
Yeah, they do. They really do.
So we've seen how scientists have messed with, life and death, but what about trying to create entirely new life forms?
You're talking about those attempts to create those human-ape hybrids, right?
Exactly. That's a story that always gets to me.
Me too. It's just so disturbing.
It's one of those things that really makes you think about ethics in science.
Yeah, like how far is too far? So this was in the 1920s, right?
Yep. This Soviet biologist named Ilya Ivanov, he wanted to create a human-ape hybrid.
I mean, it sounds like something out of a horror movie.
It kind of does. But at the time, Darwin's theory of evolution was still pretty controversial.
So he thought creating a hybrid would prove that humans and apes were related.
Yeah, he saw it as the ultimate proof. But his methods were, pretty messed up.
Yeah, he tried to inseminate chimpanzees with human sperm. Like, that's just wrong.
It was. And he was working in secret under a lot of pressure. He was afraid of what would happen if people found out.
I bet. It's crazy that he even got funding for this.
Well, he had some support from the Institut Pasteur in France.
Really? So even back then, some scientists were interested in this idea.
Yeah, they were trying to understand human origins, and this seemed like a way to do it.
But thank goodness it never worked. Can you imagine?
It would have been a disaster. I mean, what kind of life would those hybrids have had?
It's just awful to think about. It's a reminder that science can't just be about knowledge. We have to think about the consequences.
Absolutely. Ethics can't be an afterthought. Okay, so we've talked about messing with life and death and creating new life. Now let's talk about how we perceive the world.
Our senses, like sight, smell, taste.
Exactly. There are some really strange experiments about that. Turns out our senses aren't as reliable as we think.
Like those optical illusions that make you see things that aren't there.
Yeah, exactly. Or think about the placebo effect. People feel better just because they think they're getting medicine.
Right, it's all in their head. Okay, so what kind of bizarre experiments did they do with the senses?
Well, there's one with a tickle machine.
A tickle machine, what's that?
It wasn't a real machine. It was just a way to trick people. They told people they were being tickled by a machine.
But they weren't.
Nope. It was actually a person tickling them.
So what was the point?
They wanted to see if people would still feel ticklish, even if they thought it was a machine doing it.
No? Did it work?
Yep. People reported feeling tickled even though they knew logically that it couldn't be the machine.
So it's like our brains are tricking us.
In a way, yeah. Our expectations can really influence how we experience things.
That's crazy. Okay, what else?
Well, there's the classic wine experiment. They gave wine experts white wine that had been dyed red.
Wait, really? And they couldn't tell?
Nope. They described the wine using terms they would normally use for red wine.
So they were totally fooled by the color.
Exactly. It shows how much our expectations can affect our sense of taste.
That's wild. I'd be so embarrassed if I was one of those experts.
We all fall for these kinds of tricks sometimes. Our senses aren't perfect.
Okay, so tickling, taste. What other senses did they experiment with?
Well, there were attempts to, transmit smells through the airwaves, like smell-o-vision.
I remember hearing about that. But did it actually work?
It's hard to say. Some people claimed they could smell things, but it was probably just suggestion.
Right, like the power of the mind.
Our sense of smell is so tied to our memories and emotions.
Yeah, certain smells can really take you back.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about how our senses can be tricked, but sometimes we miss things even when we're paying attention.
You're talking about the invisible gorilla experiment, right?
Yep. That's a classic example of how we can be blind to things, even if they're right in front of us.
I remember watching that video. It's amazing how you can miss something so obvious.
Our brains are constantly filtering information. We can't pay attention to everything.
It makes you wonder what else we're missing in everyday life.
Right. It's a good reminder to, slow down and really pay attention.
Be more mindful. Okay, so from tickling to wine tasting to invisible gorillas, our senses are pretty weird.
They definitely are. And they're not the only thing that can play tricks on us. Our memories can be just as unreliable.
Oh, yeah. I remember reading about that neurosurgeon, Wilder Penfield. He stimulated parts of the brain and triggered memories.
Yeah, he was mapping the brain, basically, and he found that certain areas were connected to specific memories.
Like he could make people remember things they'd forgotten.
Exactly. It was a huge discovery. But it also raised questions about how memories are stored.
Like if they're physical things in our brains.
Right, and what happens to them when we die.
Okay, now we're getting deep.
It's all connected. These experiments make you think about the big questions.
Okay, back to the Tsar experiments. There's that one with the cannibalistic flatworms. They learn by eating each other, right?
Yeah, that was James McConnell's work. He claimed that he could transfer memories between flatworms by having them eat each other.
So, like, if one worm learned to run a maze and another worm ate it,
The second worm would learn the maze faster.
that's both fascinating and disgusting.
It was definitely a controversial study. A lot of people didn't believe it.
It's like something out of a sci-fi movie.
Yeah. It kind of is, but it raises interesting questions about how memory works.
Yeah, and whether it can be transferred like that.
Exactly. Okay, so we've gone from probing memories in the brain to potentially transferring them through cannibalism.
And now we're going to.
Yeah.
Mind control.
Well, not exactly mind control, but something pretty close. This psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron, he did these experiments with electroshock therapy and LSD.
Oh, no. This doesn't sound good.
It wasn't. He called it psychic driving. He basically tried to erase people's memories and reprogram their personalities.
That's terrifying. And he did this to actual patients.
Yeah, it was a dark chapter in the history of psychiatry. He thought he was curing mental illness, but his methods were brutal.
And they caused a lot of harm.
They did. It's a reminder that just because someone is a doctor doesn't mean they're ethical.
Yeah, power can corrupt anyone. These experiments on memory are fascinating, but they also make me feel a little uneasy.
I know what you mean. It's like we're getting a glimpse into the inner workings of the mind, but it can be disturbing.
It's like opening Pandora's box.
Exactly. But once you've seen what's inside, you can't unsee it.
True. Okay, well, I'm ready for a change of pace. Let's move on to something a little less intense.
Sounds good. Let's talk about social dynamics, how people behave in groups.
Okay, that sounds a bit more lighthearted. Hopefully.
We'll see. Social experiments can be just as bizarre as those on the brain or the body.
I believe it. So what kind of social experiments are we talking about?
Okay, so we've looked at how scientists have poked around life and death, our senses, and even our memories. Now let's get into social dynamics.
How people act in groups, right?
Exactly, like how we influence each other, how social norms and stuff shape what we do.
That's like science meets real life, right?
Yeah.
Out in the world.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. You can't really do these in a lab.
Right. So are we talking like psychology experiments?
Yeah, kind of, but less about what's going on in one person's head and more about how people act together.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of bizarre stuff did they do in this area?
Well, there's the famous one, the elephant on LSD.
Wait, what? They gave an elephant LSD. Why?
This was back in the 60s. People were experimenting with LSD a lot back then.
Right, but on an elephant. Seems a bit much.
They wanted to see if it would trigger must, you know, that state where male elephants get super aggressive.
Oh, right. I've heard of that. Not a good idea to be around an elephant then.
No kidding. And unfortunately, the experiment went wrong. The elephant died.
Oh, man.
That's awful.
It was a real tragedy. And it caused a lot of controversy about using animals in research.
Yeah, I can see why. Okay, so maybe let's move on from elephants. What else did they study?
Well, they did some interesting stuff with cockroaches.
Cockroaches. What could they possibly learn from cockroaches about social behavior?
More than you might think. So this guy, Robert Zejonk, he wanted to see how being around others affects performance.
Okay.
And he had cockroaches race each other. And he found that when they were alone, they ran slower.
So being around other cockroaches motivated them to go faster, like peer pressure.
Exactly. It's called social facilitation. But then he had them do a more complicated task, like run a maze. And I bet they did worse with a crowd.
Yep, like stage fright. The pressure made them mess up.
It's funny how that applies to humans, too. Like public speaking. Some people thrive on it, others freeze up.
Totally. It's all about how we react to the social situation.
Speaking of social situations, there's an experiment about something I personally find really uncomfortable being stared at.
Oh, yeah, the staring experiment. That one's a classic.
It's creepy just thinking about it. So how did they study that?
They started with sheep, actually. Just staring at them for like 10 minutes straight.
Sheep. Okay, that's a bit random.
They wanted to see how animals would react first. Then they did it with humans.
Wait, they had people just stare at each other.
Well, they got consent first. But yeah, for an extended period of time.
I can only imagine how awkward that would be.
It was. But they found that both the sheep and the humans showed signs of distress.
It makes sense. Eye contact is such a powerful thing. Like, if someone stares at you for too long, it feels threatening.
Exactly. It can signal aggression or even, like, romantic interest, depending on the context.
Right, right. Okay, so cockroaches, sheep, and awkward staring contests. What other social experiments did they do?
Well, there's the famous monkey experiments by Harry Harlow. Those were really groundbreaking.
Oh, yeah, the ones with the surrogate mothers. That was all about attachment, right?
Exactly. He showed that baby monkeys need more than just food to thrive. They need comfort and affection, too.
Yeah, they preferred the cloth mother, even if the wire mother had the milk bottle.
It was a huge shift in how people thought about child development.
Like, love is just as important as food.
Exactly. Okay, so those are some examples of, like, the more positive side of social experiments. But there are some darker ones, too.
Darker how?
Well, like the Stanford prison experiment. That one got pretty out of control.
Oh yeah, I've heard of that one. The college students who were pretending to be prisoners and guards.
It was supposed to be a simulation, but it became all too real.
The guards started abusing the prisoners, right?
Yeah, it escalated really quickly. They had to stop the experiment early because it was so disturbing.
It's scary how easily people can become cruel when they have power over others.
It shows how much our behavior is influenced by the situation we're in.
Yeah, like the roles we play. It's a reminder that anyone is capable of doing bad things, given the right circumstances.
It's a sobering thought. Okay, and one more social experiment we should talk about is the bystander effect.
The what?
The bystander effect. It's the idea that the more people who witness an emergency, the less likely anyone is to help.
Wait, really? Why is that?
It's like everyone thinks someone else will do something, so no one takes responsibility.
Oh, that's messed up. So it's better to be in trouble when only one person is around.
Well, it's more complicated than that, but it does highlight the power of social dynamics.
Yeah, how we can be influenced by the people around us, even in life or death situations.
It's a good reminder to be aware of these things, to not just follow the crowd.
Right. Think for yourself and be ready to act, even if no one else is.
Exactly. So from the elephant on LSD to the Stanford prison experiment and the bystander effect, these social experiments really make you think.
They do. They show that human behavior is complex and often unpredictable.
And that the line between good and bad can be pretty thin.
Yeah. This whole deep dive into bizarre experiments has been a wild ride.
We've seen the best and the worst of science, the creativity and the craziness.
It's made me question a lot of things.
That's the point, right? To challenge our assumptions and make us think about the world in new ways.
Yeah, it's been eye-opening, that's for sure. Thanks for taking us on this journey.
My pleasure. Always happy to explore the strange side of science.
And thanks to all of you for listening to The Deep Dive. We hope you'll join us again next time for another exploration of the weird and wonderful world of science.